Hello, welcome to Adventures in Angular. It's been a while. This is the podcast where we keep you updated on all things Angular related. This show is produced by two companies, Top End Devs and Envoy. Top End Devs is where we create top end devs who get top end pay and recognition while working on interesting problems and making meaningful community contributions. And Envoy, which offers remote design and software development services on a task basis, so clients only pay when tasks are delivered and approved. In today's episode, we will talk about reactiveness in Angular and how you can still use RxJS. So that's correct. We're not necessarily going to talk about signals today, although we might touch on the subject, but how you can simplify your reactivity while still using RxJS. And well, for that, we have a very special guest. So Dean Radcliffe is a web developer of many years and the creator of RxFX, which is the library we're going to be talking about throughout this episode. So we're going to get back to Dean in a second. But also joining me in today's episode is Armen Vardanian.
Hey everyone. First episode this year. I missed this.
Yeah. And well, I am Lucas Paganini, one of the other hosts in the show. So let's get started. So, Dean.
Yes, sir.
Please pitch RxFX to the audience.
All right. RxFX, that's RxFX, is framework independent state management and effect management with concurrency control like RxJS has. And it is built on RxJS. It's interoperable with RxJS, but it brings a better developer experience and a shorter learning curve than using only RxJS. Compared to RxJS, RxFX will still concurrency control your async functions, like with those concat map, switch map operators, but in a way that'll be simpler, safer, and with greater readability.
Okay,
that's really interesting. And I was actually taking a look at the repo. So at the root, I noticed that in the package.json file, you don't have RxJS as a dependency. So
I do have RxJS as a dependency,
but not in the root.
Oh, not in the root. The root.
Okay.
The root repository like Lucas said. There's a constellation of libraries. And the primary ones are going to be RxFX/bus, RxFX/effect, and RxFX/service. And they each provide similar reactive and concurrency control benefits, but with a little bit of a flavor and different mental models. So, for example, the bus is an event bus. It was actually derived from a simple RxJS event bus that the company, I don't know, somebody posted, I can't remember the name or the exact company name. It had to do with the RxJS creators. There was a simple event bus, and then I built on that event bus, and the event bus brings pub sub benefits. So that's like you trigger an event somewhere and an event listener responds by running an async function, but that listener can be concurrency controlled. So imagine having your RxJS operators kind of baked into the listener. So that's the bus model. It has the advantage of your code that's triggering events. Say you have a component that triggers an event when it's clicked to save something to a database. But now you want to send an analytics event that button was clicked, right? So the publish, subscribe, pub sub metaphor says you don't have to go into that component with the button and add code to it. You can listen for that click event with a bus listener, and then send analytics events that way. And I've done this on an application that had many questions. It was a survey application, and the goal was that once we developed a question type, that we wanted to keep that component closed, like closed to modification. We should be able to extend the behavior of the components without having to go in and modify the components. And so by having each component put an event on the event bus, it's easy to add event listeners, like an analytics listener. And suppose you want to say your analytics events should be sent serially so that they don't take up more than one HTTP connection at a time. Well, then you just set the concurrency mode of that listener. And that also gets you out of the pickle of, if you were to modify the component and you'd have some code that says save to the database and some code that says analytics. Well, is there a correct order to put those calls? And if you put the analytics call first and that analytics call errors for some reason, is that going to keep it? Are you going to keep from needing to, is that going to prevent the database call from functioning? So it's actually much cleaner not to keep piling things into the one component, but to set up separate listeners. And another benefit of RxFX is error handling. So if that analytics event listener acts up, it doesn't kill the save to database event listener. So you have separation through the pub sub metaphor, like even more complete separation and error handling than with raw RxJS.
That's really interesting because in RxJS, error handling can be a bit of a pain point for lots of developers. There are all of those tools. For example, we have retry when, right, with the count. We could just use catch error and so on. But some of those tools, especially I think from the perspective of the documentation, aren't readily obvious that those can be used for error handling. And yeah, I've honestly seen lots of people who have worked with RxJS for a while, but they would probably get confused by what means retry when or something, or how to what scenarios you can have with error handling. So yeah, this really sounds interesting. I'm just taking a look at the effects library.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, you mentioned pain points with RxJS, and I was at a conference, which site is that on? 4 years ago, called RxJS Live. And I've basically followed the RxJS core team, and I follow and listen to what people say the top pain points are with RxJS. And of course, as I hear them, I think, well, maybe I could address that in RxFX. And I believe I have. And so I'll touch on some of them. Tracy Lee and Ben Lesh and Jay Phelps, the core people that give workshops on RxJS, what they're suggesting you can get stuck on, and which they'll help you with, but RxFX will also help you with, is so subscription management. When do you subscribe? What do you do with subscription objects? How do you choose an operator? And is concat or exhaust map correct for your case? And error handling. So I think subscriptions, concurrency, and error handling are some of the biggest challenges people have with RxJS. And RxFX has solutions to all of those with a simpler developer friendly API.
One thing that I'm still wondering about, I'm seeing lots of different examples in the repo.
Yeah.
And I see very little RxJS in actuality. So is this meant to be like a sort of total wrapper around RxJS? You don't really need to touch RxJS itself?
Yes, but you can grow to use all of the RxJS features. It's truly interoperable. Yeah. But so in the show notes, I provided a link to a Stack Overflow post where I said, here's a situation. You have a bell ringing function. It plays some audio. And so it's async because it takes some time. Now you want to create a web form with a button that rings the bell. Now, if that button is rung or clicked while the bell is ringing, you would have two bells ringing at once and it might overload your audio and sound bad. So we want to concurrency control the bell, like put them in a queue or cut off the previous bell or throttle. Like, so we want a concurrency control mechanism.
Yep.
And we also want cancellation, because what if the user just wants to cancel on that bell? Simple example, there's one button to ring, one button to cancel, and then concurrency control. Well, I sketched out what I thought the RxJS version of that was. And it was about 15 lines. There were two subjects. There were various imported operators, take until.
Yeah.
There actually needs to be three subjects. Take until, a switch map.
Yep.
It was what I call operator soup. And the RxFX, given a function that returns a promise or an observable for ringing the bell, the audio, it's one line to wrap it in an effect with the create effect function, and it's one line to request it, which is the same for RxJS, one line to like trigger the bell ringing. But then cancellation is just .cancel current, and canceling the entire queue is .cancel current and queued. So it's a question of when should you like deep dive into RxJS? Well, if you want to tap something, if you want to do retry when, if you want to use any of the fancy operators, if you want to zip two services together, that's fine. But as far as concurrency control and cancellation, like you shouldn't need to go into that much detail or have that many imports. Like think about Lodash, how you just take your function, pass it into a Lodash function, and get a new function out that has new behavior. It should be that simple. That's the premise of RxFX.
So what's really got me interested when I was thinking about this in the context of Angular and NGRX, could I, for example, and I will tell you in a moment why I'm asking this, like I have an observable that does something. Can I just pick it up and turn it into an effect, like in the RxFX? I already have an observable that works in a certain way, but I want to sort of turn it to an RxFX effect to be able to, I don't know, cancel it or add something to it or pause it or whatever capabilities it offers.
Do you have the observable as like, do you have a function that returns an observable, like an endpoint that returns an AJAX observable? Like, I mean, a function that returns an AJAX observable. What is your observable? Go a little more detail.
Let me just give you the exact thing that I had in my mind. So, for example, in NGRX, we have the NGRX package, and it's fairly decent to create like effects based on actions and so on. But it doesn't have very many features. So essentially, it provides you with a function to sort of register an observable that NGRX will listen to and do whatever you want it to do. And it gives you the actions observable, like whatever actions happened in your, application. And you just mix them, and then you have to go and use a bunch of RxJS if you want something complex. Like 90% of scenarios, just like I make an HTTP request, then dispatch this or that action. But sometimes you need like, I want to retry this. Is this something specific happens? Or maybe in some cases, I want to throw away the previous request and start a new one. But in another scenario, I want to do something else. And it becomes, as you mentioned, like an operator soup in the effect. It becomes really... so, and the funny thing is, like in NGRX, when you create an effect, especially like you have functional effects now, you have a variable that represents this effect. But you never use it. like it would be great if you could bring it to your component, and for example, in some scenario, a button was clicked and you could say, okay, cancel this effect or pause this effect or something in that regard. So I was thinking if I could take these actions observable, that is the thing that I need from NGRX. I need to know what actions like happen.
Yeah.
And just, I don't know, plug it into this effect and maybe use it this way. That's why.
So okay, I'm still a maybe, but let me help clarify it. So there are observables that are like the sources of effects running, and is that what you're
There is
talking
one
about?
observable. Yeah. NGRX gives you one observable. It's called actions, and
Actions,
whenever an
right.
action is dispatched somewhere, this action will, send a new emission.
So actions. That sounds like a hot observable.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, it's a hot observable. So with you generally wouldn't have that wrapped in RxFX. You would maybe trigger some effects based on a filtered set of actions, right? So you have observables like that are hot and they are like the sources of information, and then you have observables that are usually called cold that are like doing the effect, doing the Ajax, ringing the bell.
In the context of the specific what NGRX does, it gives you a custom operator called of type, and you can pass it actions that you want. I want this action. For example, if the load data action was triggered, then it will sort of filter out and only start working. And then you give this entire thing to the create effect function that NGRX has, and then it registers the effect. I think it has one or two methods that you can use. You can definitely, it has methods used in unit testing, like, but the object that it returns itself, it doesn't have very many other like useful things. So that's what got me wondering, could I sort of enhance it, just use the same pattern, but instead just feed this effect to something from RxFX so that I will be able to try stuff on demand or sort of modify concurrency or whatever without going deep into RxJS operators.
Yes, I mean, I hope so, but my big disclaimer is that I don't work in Angular much these days, though I have, and I developed this library when I was consulting and switching between Angular and React, and so I wanted something that was portable I could take with me. So as far as how to make this interact with NGRX, I have not explored that use case. But my general sense of it is that you would have an effect like ringing a bell. You would have your actions of type, and then you would basically subscribe to those actions of type and say, when those come through, ring the bell. And now you have a concurrency controlled, cancelable bell on the one hand. It's independent. And then you might use RxJS if your actions are not RxJS, NGRX. If your actions were already available through NGRX, then you could just send them to the service or effect. So that's probably how it would work, but I haven't tried it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like from the top of my head, what I could do is create one NGRX effect that just takes all actions and sends this to like RxFX service.
Sounds like
use that RxFX service,
And so what would be different is like if you were doing this purely in NGRX to cancel the bell ringing, you might have another action that you would dispatch to do it. But with RxFX, you wouldn't need that. You would just go to the ringing bell service or effect and just say .cancel current. So in some ways, it factors some things out of the RxJS NGRX land that you don't necessarily need to live in that land. So, for example, the like I just said, cancellation, you can just go directly to the ringing bell and cancel it, right? But another thing is the status of whether the bell is ringing or not. And there's a linked code sandbox in the RxFX documentation that has one of these bells you can play with. But you want to be able to display to the user whether the bell is ringing or not. And prior to prior to my working on RxFX, and almost every app I did, I had a field in state called loading, right? Or for a bell ringing. I would explicitly code that into the state model. But then I said, well, if you've got a promise that isn't resolved, if you've got a bell that's still ringing, how come we don't automatically have access to a field? Like, how come I have to build that into the state model of my app? Because the problem with that is, you have all these examples that say, all right, well, you're going to have an Angular component that has a button, and then you're going to use the HTTP client to, fetch some stuff. So the first thing you do is you're going to, set is loading to true. Then you're going to do the effect. Then when it's done, you're going to set is loading to false. And that manual tracking of the loading state is bundled into RxFX. You can track the loading state. So I also have an example of a counter that's asynchronous. It takes 2 seconds to increment the counter. And the state model only contains the count, but RxFX keeps track of whether it's executing or not.
Yeah. That's what I was, and of course we will now inevitably stumble into the signals topic, because I was just because signals got now a very deep integration, despite them not being like even 1 year old. But we have now NGRX signals, so you can build your like state management without the Redux pattern, just with signals, without observables. And I was thinking, like, the weak point for me in NGRX signal is probably the effects, because effects are essentially the same that we have in NGRX effect, just baked into the signal blend. And that got me thinking, especially with the loading example, because there you will have to do like even more work, because you are inside a signal state, and like, so you start an HTTP call, for instance, you have to go like patch state loading through something like that, and then you will always have to add this line of code and the other line that says something like finalize patch state loading false, and it's not a pattern that I personally like, and you can't sort of make a generic function that does that, because the loading state can be different depending on whatever you are trying to accomplish, unless we resort to some magic strings or something. But that's not a good solution to that.
But I mean, we've had promises since 2015, and 9 years later, like, how come we don't have like an abstraction that just automatically knows? Like, how come we're still writing manual loading states? Like, why don't we have an abstraction that knows whether it's executing or not, and is cancelable if the endpoint, of course, returns an observable, because promises are not so simple to cancel as observables, and that's one of the greatest things about observables. And I'm super geeked on observables. They're coming into the language, into the browsers are starting to integrate it. Slightly different API than RxJS observables. I'm still learning about, like, how am I going to have to adjust my code when those come into play. But it's I mean, RxJS is a tremendous library. If I could give your listeners a little history lesson of async, I did a little research to find out, like, how RxJS and promises evolved, and could I could do that now or later.
I mean, we sort of can, but it's interesting. I've never thought about it this way, because I've never really worked with promises. No, I have worked with promises.
Oh, really?
But since I started doing, I worked with promises when I was doing AngularJS. We didn't have we didn't know much about RxJS back then. Then Angular 2 dropped in 2016, and since then I've not really touched promises that much, unless I was, I don't know, teaching someone about them or stuff. I wasn't really using them in the code, but it never I just thought, promises are sort of weak and observables are very powerful, and I can do HTTP calls with observables. Then I don't care about promises.
No, I mean, that's actually very true, and I don't think it's judgmental or critical at all. Promises, you could say, are a subset of observables.
Definitely.
Right? And so you can build a promise with an observable, but the reverse is not true. And so let me talk about mental models, because my mental model has been evolving a lot over time. And I think I can clarify for the listeners a lot of things that you hear about what observables are, because that's even kind of, confusing. So observables have been described any number of ways. They've been described as lazy. They've been called just functions. An observable is just a function, which is the hardest explanation I have to grasp. They've been described as streams of values, or they've been described as promises with more than one value. So a lot of those are confused. Oh, they've also been described as push collections. They've been described as, is it unicast or multicast? Well, it's unicast, but how do I tell? It's very hard to piece together like what the heck is an observable with all of these explanations. So I have what I think is going to be the final explanation of observable that people will need to hear. And here's this. Observables are a template for a running process. They are like the string ls-l. Okay? So they're like the string ls-l because the string ls-l is not executing. It's just a template from which you can create a process that lists the files in a directory, right? So observables aren't really lazy any more than a template is lazy, because when you click on the template to create a new document, it creates a new document. When you have a string, a command string to run a process, it runs a new process. So yes, you can call them lazy because they don't give you values till you subscribe, but that's exactly like the way that a Unix command line string doesn't give you lines of output until you execute it and hit enter. So you look at what can a Unix process do? And this is what's so strong about observables. They can do everything that a Unix process can do. They can have an exit code of true or false. I mean, basically they can complete or error like an observable.
Yeah.
And they can produce one or more values. They can also produce zero values, which is why the description of an observable as a stream of values, it misses the mark. An observable is a template for a running process. A running process, which is a subscription, consumes some resources. So the main thing about an observable is that it explains how to consume and release some resources. Just like a command line string tells you how to consume some resources, and then it has a standard way of canceling it. So it's perfectly valid to have a Unix command line like rm/rf node modules, which doesn't produce a bunch of values. And it's perfectly valid to have an observable that isn't about values. It's about getting some work done.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. Actually, I've never thought of that sort of comparison, and it makes sense, especially that we have like in like Unix, you have the pipe operator, right? You can pipe commands, pipe results from one, and then RxJS, we sort of have the same thing. We can take one observable, pipe result to another.
Yeah.
That's really interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, it's just such a perfect match. It's a template. It's a command line string. That's like a perfect match for me. And so what I found is that the best use of an observable, which is of course a description of some work that can be done, a template for doing work. The best use of an observable, and pretty much the only thing you need to do in RxFX, is use an observable as a return value. So that's kind of talking about cold observables. But it could also be a hot. I don't really find there's much distinction between hot and cold. There's still a allocation of a resource that you can release either way. And they may produce values or they may not. But so an observable is a great return value. And in RxFX, when you return an observable from a function into an effect or a bus listener or a service, you don't have to call .subscribe on it, right? And it works, because if you're ringing a bell and you have an observable for ringing a bell, when the bell is rung, you return the observable for ringing the bell. Well, RxFX knows that if you return an observable, well, of course I have to subscribe to it if the concurrency model says subscribe right now, because there are concurrency models that don't say subscribe right away. For example, a blocking concurrency model, also known as exhaust map. So observables make a lot of sense as a return value, and I've written very large and very async applications with RxFX using observables, and I never call .subscribe. Just return an observable. So, for example, my flagship app for personal use that I can share around is called Inbox Radio, and it lets me stream music that has been sent to me in my Gmail inbox. And so there's a lot of async going on there. You have to get messages that match a pattern, then you have to get the attachments, and you don't want to download them in parallel. You want to download them serially because you're going to play them serially. And then you have to decode the stuff, then you have to play it. And so these chains of things are not explicitly chained. The event bus is sitting there, making one of them subscribe to another. And basically this whole thing doesn't have concat map explicitly written in it. It has create queuing service, and it doesn't have .subscribe because you return an observable and RxFX calls subscribe on it. So that kind of takes care of where do you put your subscription objects? Well, you don't generally need to see the subscription objects in this. The exception to that would be if you had an observable of button clicks, for example, and you needed to like call an effect on every button click from that observable, then you would subscribe to that outer observable and say, okay, each time a notification on the observable comes in, then call this effect. So that's where you would, if you had like a native RxJS observable, you could totally call .subscribe on it and do whatever you want. But if you were returning it as the return value from an effect or a bus listener, you wouldn't need to tag .subscribe on the end of it.
That's fascinating, actually, as you mentioned, exhaust map and stuff. So it's nice to hear that those sorts of things are taken care about, because for the life of me, I couldn't explain the difference between exhaust map and concat map. I've looked it out like a bunch of times. I can easily explain the difference between merge map and switch map.
Okay, so here's
yeah.
So here's a gift. This is for everybody. It's a free way to keep all these things straight. Can you scroll down in the RxFX repo?
Yep. In the effects one, I was in the service one. Let me go to,
I think either one of them. So do you see some cards that have pictures on them?
Oh, Dean, by the way, if you're comfortable with that, we could even share your screen. Some people can be watching from YouTube, so they could be seeing the live stream.
Well, I would happily do that. Sure, let's do that. Okay, I think you're seeing a GitHub repo.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the RxFX main repo. And if you scroll down, there's some code examples, and then there's a list of the libraries.
Yeah, in the FX one, there's the fascinating set of cards.
Yes, and so here is the set of cards that you can use. I have not printed them myself yet on like true quality card stock, but if people are interested in that, I would do that. I would love to have these at my desk when we collaborated with desks next to desks and other people. But yeah, so this gives friendly names to each of the modes. It has pictures, and then in the little in this window, it says also known as merge map, also known as concat map. So, my bias is to kind of tuck RxJS into something as a bunch of implementation details. I'm not trying to teach people how to, necessarily use RxJS better if they can get the first 90% of use cases under friendlier names and in a friendlier library. Then that's kind of what I'm advocating for. I've gotten several teams that I'm on to adopt this early in the development life cycle, and then when people can use one of these, they use that, and then if it comes up against something that doesn't fit into that paradigm, well then, hey, this lets you use any amount of RxJS on top of it. But yeah, I would say that this is mnemonic and friendly for people to remember the modes and just have good pictures of it, because these modes, this is what's amazing about what they came up with when they came up with RxJS. And I'm going to go rewind a little bit in history. I'll stop sharing though. So in 2004, Gmail came out, and Ajax started to get used like in seriousness. And as Ajax was getting used between 2004 and 2011, callback hell was like really forming. And, when you attach an event listener to something, if that event listener starts some async process and then that event comes in again, you don't have concurrency control. So 7 years after like Ajax appeared, Microsoft Labs, our research and development, went down and said, we got to solve this async problem, and we got to solve it for good. And it hit all of the use cases. And this is 4 years before Promises. And they came up with the ReactiveX, project, which, became RxJS and all the implementations in all the languages. So they had, PhD computer science people and everything really looking at this async problem and saying, like, what are all the tools we need to solve every use case in async? And they built it. But by 2012, the A+ team was working on Promises, and Promises were gaining traction. I think partly they were winning the race because the documentation for RxJS was just really problematic. They, like the documentation for merge map, it's obtuse. It projects inner observables into the output observable, and it's just not descriptive enough. So Promises from 2011 to 2015 were gaining mind share, and they were an improvement over just regular functions, but they didn't get all the way to RxJS. And then Promises were adopted, but Promises can't control concurrency in all the ways that RxJS can. And so those concurrency operators that are so hard to remember, but described in those cards that I showed, those things are amazing because they solve for all async combinations. And I can describe this in real life too. It isn't just RxJS. They didn't just solve like for web development. It's like extrapolatable. It can be extrapolated to real life. So I gave the analogy on the React show. Suppose I am making a sandwich for my daughter. She wants a grilled cheese sandwich. I'm on the stove. I'm busy. I've been requested to make a sandwich. I'm busy making the sandwich. And she says, Dad, I want chicken nuggets instead. Well, these 5 concurrency modes, well, 4 of them are in RxJS. I added the 5th one. These 5 concurrency modes describe what I can respond with, right? I can merge map. So in other words, I can just start a new pan, cooking the chicken nuggets next to the grilled cheese. I can say, okay, Sierra, but only after I make the grilled cheese, I'll get started on the chicken nuggets. That's concat map. I can say, oh, you want chicken nuggets? Well, I better stop making the grilled cheese. I'll make you chicken nuggets instead. And I can also say, no, Sierra, I'm already making your grilled cheese. I'm not going to start chicken nuggets. So that happens to be exhaust map. Finally, the final one, which I just came up with by looking at what are all the possibilities. The final one is I'm making the grilled cheese. Sierra says, can I have chicken nuggets? I just turn off the stove for the grilled cheese and I say, I can't deal with all these requests. Just make your own lunch. So I can walk away from that. These are universal, right? And so it's really cool that RxJS has all of the universal possibilities embedded in it. It's not cool that everyone isn't using it. And I think the reason is because the documentation isn't friendly enough. And so instead of trying to improve the documentation and doing, that kind of long but noble process of trying to contribute back to an open source repository you use. But I just think, well, it's time for a higher level of abstraction. And I don't think I'm on the wrong track because, like, I ask for comparisons. I say, how would you do this the RxJS way? And it's 15 to 20 confusing lines with, 7 levels of nesting versus, 1 or 2 levels of nesting and like 5 lines. So I'm going to stick with this approach of creating a wrapper library. And hopefully, hey, if any of this ends up back in RxJS, if it ends up in React, I don't care. Like, I'm not saying everybody has to use this exactly this way, but I am saying I think there is an abstraction just waiting to be, birthed into the community.
This truly has been an evening of interesting analogies. Thanks for explaining me the difference between exhaust map and cut map. By the way, I find the library really fascinating, and I'm a bit surprised I haven't heard about it before. I will research it. Please let me know if it's okay if I ping you with questions from time to time.
Yeah, the best place to engage with me right now is through the GitHub repo.
Yep.
Stars are welcome, discussions and issues also, and that's where we can talk about the repo. If we want to talk a little more generally about stuff, I'm on Twitter at /X at DeanDevDad, and that'll go in the show notes. And yeah, I mean, I would love to engage on this more. Like I said, I have my workplace where I've gotten now 3 teams, using this as, a starting point. And so that's probably where, more of my time gets spent in the workplace than marketing it. But since I've reconnected with this awesome top end devs team and all the shows that they run, I was like, well, sure, I'd love to talk about it more widely.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And for anyone who's listening to this and wants to try out RxFX and other frameworks, we do have an entire episode about how this can be used in React. So if you're interested, you can check out the latest episode we did on React Roundup, where we also talked to Dean about how we can use RxFX to simplify some of the issues that React developers generally run into. So yeah, Dean, this again, this has been great again because the React episode was also awesome. I really love the analogies to your daughter, and it makes it so much easier to remember what exhaust map means because now I can just remember Dean exhausted. Like I'm. Yeah. No. Yeah. So thanks again, man. Hope you come back even more times whenever possible. So let's do a quick round of promos before wrapping things up.
Yeah.
So Dean, you were mentioning your Twitter, the GitHub repository for the project. Is there anything else you would like to promote?
Just that.
Okay. Awesome. So yeah, just reiterating, anyone who's listening to this, if you can stop what you're doing for just 10 seconds and go into the GitHub repository and give it a star, that could create a chain reaction that is going to lead to eventually us having better names to our RxJS operators. So please do that for the entire community and future generations.
Well, I should mention there is a thread, a discussion in the RxJS repo that opened up recently where they're seeking to do some renaming in RxJS 8. So you can find that on Ben Lesch's profile on Twitter. And so if you have opinions about it like I do, you can contribute in their discussion directly. I'm sure they'd appreciate the community input.
Okay, awesome. And Armen, I'm gonna give this to you in a second. I know that you have a special announcement, so I'm gonna leave you to the end. Mine is just gonna be the regular episode intro. So if you're interested in outsourcing your software or design teams, or even better, extending your design and software development teams, you should definitely check out unvoid.com. It's unvoid.com. And yeah, that's basically going to be my promo. So Armen, please take away. I know you have a huge announcement.
Well, it's not that huge. The huge announcement was like a month ago. As I've mentioned on the previous episodes and also on Twitter and LinkedIn and all the other places I visit, I don't know. I wrote a book on Angular. It's called Modern Angular. It's with the Manning Publications. It's in early access now. So out of the 10 total chapters, we have now 5 out. I think 2 other chapters will drop like in a week or 2, I guess. But the entire manuscript is finished, so no worries if you think I'm not gonna finish it. I have finished it. I'm just doing some polishing and listening to early access readers' comments. And by the way, the 5th chapter, the last one that is right now available, is about RxJS. So yeah, if this episode got you interested, maybe you can also take a look at that chapter. The book discusses all the new features that we have. By the way, the 6th and 7th chapter that will drop soon are all about signals, which is the, I guess, hottest topic right now. And for this episode, I actually got a special promo code from Manning Publications. So you can use the promo code PODANGULAR24. Let's also put that in the description. To get 45% off any Manning product. I hope you spent it on my book, but yeah. So, and also, yeah, thanks to Manning Publication for giving me that promo code specifically for our episode. So if anyone of the listeners is interesting, take a look at the description. I will let's also put the link to the book there. So yeah, that's it. That's my promotion. Gonna be the same for a while.
Yeah. Armen, can you send it on the internal chat so that I can put it in the comment section for anyone watching the live stream?
Yeah.
45% discount. Is that what you said?
Yep. On any Manning product.
That's a huge discount. So awesome. Thanks, man. And I think the fact that you have 2 chapters about signals in Angular is really interesting because it's uncharted territory, right? Like in terms of conventions and things like that. So I think this is the kind of thing that is relevant even for those that are already experienced. Like you might be thinking, I don't need Armen's book. Like I'm already experienced in Angular. There's no need for that. And even signals. Yeah, like I'm comfortable with signals. I know that they were released with whatever, but I'm pretty sure there's something that you can learn from those 2 chapters specific to signals. So I would still highly recommend buying Armen's book, even if you feel extremely comfortable with Angular already. So yeah, coupon is in the show notes. Again, it's POD, P-O-D, Angular 24, all together, no spaces, no dashes. All right.
Thanks, man, for having
Cool book.
for saying that.
Cool book. Just checked it out.
Thank you.
All right. So, guys, thank you so much. I also putting the link to Armen's book in the comment section. So you have the coupon and the book linked there. No reason to not buy it. But yeah, again, guys, thank you so much. Dean, thanks for being on the show, for not just all the time that you spent in here, but also all the effort to build this amazing library that is available for everyone in open source. So that's really a major effort. Thank you for that. And
Sure.
yeah, well, at least that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks everyone. See you in the next one.
See you in the next one.
See ya.